Hey everybody, I'm Jack Reed with Future Pastimes, and I'm one of the designers on Arrakis, Dawn of the Fremen. Now this is a Dune-themed game that came out last year. It is set hundreds of generations before the events in Dune, when the Fremen were mostly the only people on Arrakis, and the different disparate tribes were trying to control their territories and build their sieges. So it is typically a very cutthroat game of area control with some resource development and management, and you're trying to build different kinds of developments like crysknives and still suits and ultimately sieges to win the game. So you do win if you're able to build or control 3 or more sieges by the end of a cycle, which is basically a round in Arrakis. Or to just dominate. It's possible to win the game without building any sieges if you're able to control enough of the territory that the other players don't really have any hope of winning the game. And at the end of each cycle, you can basically, as a group, decide this player is crushing it, so they've won. You don't have to go through the whole thing and say, no, we have to play it out. You have that control. And at the end of each cycle, you can also form alliances, or you can change the win conditions as well. You can say, look, I'll tell you what, why don't we have it where you're in a good, strong position, but we want to keep playing, so it's going to take you 1 more, or takes us 1 fewer, or we want to form an alliances, and we're going to divvy up how many each alliance needs to win in order to make things fair, or however you want to do it. But most of the time, you're just straightforward playing, trying to control that. Now, recently, the Dune tabletop board gaming Discord community had an invitational, which they invited me to. So it was a 4-player game, and Arrakis is 2 to 4 players. So I participated in that, and a link to that is in the description. And I invite you definitely to go watch that video, because it's a very interesting game. And this video is basically just an after-action kind of debrief with my remarks about the game, because it was a highly unusual and interesting game with a lot of remarkable things that don't typically or haven't typically happened in Arrakis. And I think it bears mentioning that when we were designing it, this is a design that's based on a classic Future Pastimes game called Borderlands, which came out in the early 80s. And it was way ahead of its time. It was kind of the answer that Future Pastimes had for Diplomacy and Risk, which are 2 games that they liked but didn't love. So you get a lot of the risk action in Arrakis, but without the dice rolling and the randomness from that. The information is all out there in Arrakis, and you are trying to just make your optimal moves and take advantage of positioning and how you've been able to marshal your forces and your other resources. And there is some diplomacy that can go on in there, but it's not such a central part of it. It also is a game that you can play in under 7 or 6 hours. It's usually about 2 hours to play a game of Arrakis. So I really love this game. For me, it was a treat to work on it when we re-themed it, or themed it specifically to the Dune universe. We made a lot of changes, every one of which was an improvement in my opinion, and also a thematic change that really, I think, spices up Borderlands in every measurable way. I have seen a couple of instances where people tried to play Arrakis as just a resource management game. They tried to play through the whole game without attacking the other players, which blew my mind when I saw them doing that. And technically, you can play the game that way, but I will be the first to admit it's not the greatest game if that's what you're trying to get out of it. If you're like, oh, I don't really have that interest in attacking the other players, then yeah, I wouldn't rate Arrakis very highly if that's the experience. It's okay. But it really shines if you're okay with attacking the other players. And the Fremen culture, that they called each other out all the time. So that's just how they did things. So it's a thematic game in that way, especially if you are attacking the other tribes and taking their territory and taking their resources, taking their water. What happened in this invitational game that was really unusual was right from the outset. So part of the setup is a phase called the Harj. and you're setting up the board, but you're playing the game during the setup. It's an important element. And the first thing that you're doing is you're going to be placing some rock tokens on the borders of the territories. And the number of rocks is going to be randomized at the start of the game. So it's going to be between 3 and 8 rocks. So the players will be placing those down. And what happened in this was right at the beginning, the players were placing rocks in almost like a contiguous line from the center of the board, which is the drum sand territory, where no players can occupy that territory. But they kind of formed this wall up into the top right corner of the board. And the rock territories make it hard for you to take territories from other players on the other side of the rock territory. You can have sandworm tokens, which can be used for combat, but they don't go through the rocks. They have to go around them. And so it made it very hard for strength to cross over, and it barely happened in that game. So those were kind of impassable sections. But then the second part is you're going to put down the 12 production sites, and those are going to be the things that produce the resources you need in the game. And those resources are food and water, worm teeth, and spice. And so the players place those as well after they've set up the rock territories. They're placing those, and the other players, I had no part in this madness. The other 3 players were putting a lot of the production sites right up around those rocks. And they concentrated most of the production sites up on that right side of the board. I tried to spread things out. I think I put 1 rock territory on the left side and 1 or 2 of the other production sites over there. But then once the production sites are on, then you populate every territory on the board, except for drum sand, with your Fremen forces. And again, you're taking turns placing 1 Fremen force in a territory. And so it's evenly divided. And so because those production sites are key to the game, those are the things that players tend to claim first during this harsh setup phase. So they're placing their forces over there, and the other 3 players were putting a lot of their strength. I was like, you know what? I was placing 4th, so I was the last player to place in each of these steps. I was like, I don't want any part of it. I gotta keep my forces together on the left side, over in the west. So the other 3 players, they were kind of spread out. They managed to capture a number of those production sites. And 1 player in particular managed to get a lot of them. And I only had 1, maybe 2. Normally, there's 12 in a 4-player game. Everyone gets 3. I think I only ended up with 1. So I wasn't producing a lot. But I did have a concentrated strength. I had almost all of my forces were adjacent to more of my forces. Whereas the other 3 players, they were a lot more spread out all over the board. And if you don't have adjacent strength, then you are in a weak and vulnerable position. So I didn't have a lot of my territories taken from me throughout the game, and that was because I always had supporting strength nearby. So I was able to take a production site from another player right on the first turn and doubling my production sites. And then I was able to slowly build up my strength. And by the end of the game, I had a lot of strength. I marshaled all of my strength sort of on the border. And I had a lot. I had sandworms, which are strong. I was producing Chris knives, which are one of the strongest tokens you can have for combat. And still suits, also, all of those add strength to your territories. And so I didn't win. I didn't win the game, and that I blame the other players for letting the player who did win. And that was because they kept trading with him and giving him what he needed to build the sieges. So he built enough sieges. He built enough sieges ultimately to the point where even if some were taken away from him, and they were, he was still able to win. So if you're able, like I say, if you're able to hold on to 3 by the end of the cycle, then you win. And that is, whether you've built 1 at the beginning during the development phase, or you have captured 1 during the action phase. And so I was able to capture a siege, and I was very well positioned to just keep going. If that game had gone another cycle, I might have been able to win it by myself. So, that's what was so me. I was so weak with only producing 1 resource on that first turn. but was still able to parlay that into something else. And again, a lot of that is that dynamic with the other players, whether if they don't attack you, or if they do trade with you, a lot can happen. But the heart of that game is taking the territories and making sure that you are able to produce or capture those resources so you can build up what you need. Sieges, but also the weapons and other items that make you a stronger Fremen faction. So it's a really interesting game. It was a couple of players who had played it before. They're very familiar with Dune board gaming in general and the Dune universe in particular. So they know Dune, and this is a very thematic game. So I think that's one of the appeals to them. And so it was a pleasure for me to play. We're going to be having our Future Pastimes Invitational for Arrakis, and that'll be announced on futurepastimes.com and as well as on our Discord and on Facebook. So if you want to participate in that, when it's announced, you let us know, and we'll be doing it certainly more than once. It's a great way to learn the game, or if you do, to just play with the designers and to talk about it. So watch that video and let me know what you think about that particular game. It was a very atypical game, although it did involve attacking the other players. It was not atypical in the sense that we were just busy farming or whatever the other players did. So that's it for this video. Thanks for watching. We'll see you again soon.